7 years after the war ended, a man walks to the gallows in Vienna. He's not a Nazi officer, he's not a concentration camp guard. He's a local politician who collaborated with the Nazi regime. By this point, most people have moved on. The war feels like ancient history. But for this man, and dozens of others across Europe, the reckoning is just beginning. Some Nazi collaborators weren't executed until the 1960s. A few weren't tried until the 1970s. And the last known execution of a Nazi collaborator didn't happen until 1998. This is the story of how justice chased down the architects of collaboration across 3 decades of post-war Europe. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Across the continent, people emerge from shelters and bunkers, uncertain what comes next. For most, the priority is simple: survival, reunion with family, reconstruction of shattered lives. But for thousands of people, the end of the war signals the beginning of something else entirely: fear. Because they know what they did during the Nazi occupation. They know the choices they made. And they know that those choices have consequences. The immediate post-war period is chaotic. In some areas, Allied forces quickly establish order. In others, local populations take justice into their own hands. Suspected collaborators are identified, arrested, or killed by vigilante mobs. Rough justice happens in the streets before any formal legal process can begin. But as the weeks and months pass, governments establish tribunals and courts. They begin the systematic process of identifying, trying, and punishing those who collaborated with the Nazi regime. In France, tens of thousands are tried. In Belgium, thousands. In Austria, Yugoslavia, Poland, Greece. Across occupied Europe, the machinery of justice rumbles to life. The trials are fast, sometimes too fast. Some accused collaborators are executed within weeks of arrest, with minimal due process. Others receive prison sentences, some are acquitted. But many escape. In the chaos of post-war Europe, with millions of displaced persons moving across borders, with communities destroyed and records lost, hundreds of collaborators simply disappear. They flee to the countryside. They change their names. They adopt new identities. They settle in small towns where no one knows their past. They believe they can hide forever. But the hunt for Nazi collaborators doesn't end with the immediate post-war period. It extends across decades. Survivor organizations work to identify the guilty. Governments slowly build cases. And periodically, someone is captured. Someone who thought they had escaped, who believed the statute of limitations had expired, who thought the world had forgotten. When they are captured, they face trial, and many of them face execution. The last Nazi collaborators to be executed were tried and put to death years, even decades, after the war ended. Their cases reveal uncomfortable truths about how long it took for justice to catch up with collaboration, and how many perpetrators escaped accountability entirely. To understand what happened to Nazi collaborators after the war, it helps to understand what collaboration actually meant during the Nazi occupation. Collaboration took many forms. At the most extreme end were people who actively participated in war crimes, local police who rounded up Jews for deportation, soldiers who committed atrocities, administrators who implemented genocidal policies at the local level. These were the most serious collaborators, the ones who didn't simply support the Nazi regime, but actively participated in its crimes. But collaboration also included less direct forms of participation: teachers who taught Nazi ideology in schools, journalists who wrote propaganda, businessmen who profited from the theft of Jewish property, informants who reported on their neighbors, local officials who cooperated with occupation authorities. The distinction matters legally and morally. Someone who informed on neighbors to the Gestapo was not committing the same crime as someone who personally shot civilians. But both were collaborators. Both made choices that had consequences for others. In France, the issue of collaboration was particularly acute. France had been defeated and occupied in 1940. The Vichy regime, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, collaborated openly with the Nazis. French police arrested Jews. French bureaucrats processed deportation orders. French businesses profited from Nazi occupation. When the war ended, France faced a reckoning. Tens of thousands of people were arrested on suspicion of collaboration. High-profile collaborators like Pierre Laval, Prime Minister of Vichy France, were tried and executed in 1945. But the process quickly became complicated by questions of degree and intent. Someone who worked for the Vichy government in a civilian capacity faced very different accountability than someone who actively participated in violence. Some people who had collaborated claimed they had no choice. Others insisted they had actually helped the resistance in secret. Separating truth from self-serving justifications was difficult. In Belgium, the situation was similar. King Leopold III faced accusations of collaboration, though this was more a matter of political controversy than criminal liability. But thousands of Belgian police and officials who had cooperated with occupation authorities faced trial. In Austria, collaboration took on a particular character. Austria was incorporated into the Third Reich in 1938 as part of the Anschluss. Austrian Nazis had played key roles in the Holocaust and in occupying territories. After the war, Austria presented itself as a victim of Nazi aggression rather than a willing participant. But the reality was more complicated. Many Austrians had actively collaborated in Nazi crimes. In Eastern Europe, collaboration was even more complex. In Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Ukraine, local populations had participated in massacres of Jews, sometimes with Nazi encouragement, but often independently. Some of these collaborators were motivated by anti-Semitism, others by nationalism and desire for independence, some by self-preservation. The belief that cooperating with the Nazis was the only way to protect their own communities. The question of how to handle these different types of collaboration would define post-war justice for decades. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many nations pursued what might be called a first wave of prosecution. The most egregious collaborators, those who had personally committed atrocities or held high positions, were tried and often executed within months of the war's end. These trials were meant to be swift demonstrations of accountability. But as governments stabilized and the initial urgency faded, prosecutions slowed. Many accused collaborators were released, particularly in Western Europe and Austria, as Cold War concerns took precedence over Nazi-era crimes. It was only decades later that a second wave of prosecutions began, and some of these trials and executions would occur in the 1960s, 1970s, and even later. The immediate post-war period saw the most concentrated wave of collaborator executions. In France alone, an estimated 4,000 people were executed for collaboration in the years immediately following liberation, many of them without formal trials, some by military tribunal with minimal due process. The most prominent executions occurred in 1945 and 1946. Pierre Laval, Prime Minister of Vichy France, was tried in October 1945 and executed by firing squad on October 15th. He went to his death, proclaiming his loyalty to France and insisting that his collaboration had been forced upon him by circumstances. Few believed him. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the figurehead of Vichy France, was tried in July 1945. His death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment due to his advanced age. He was 89 years old. He spent the remaining years of his life in prison on the island of Eu, where he died in 1951. In Belgium, Léon de Grelle, the leader of the Belgian fascist Rexist movement and a volunteer in the Waffen-SS, escaped Belgium after the war and fled to Spain, where he lived under Franco's protection until his death in 1994. He was sentenced to death in absentia, but never faced execution. In Norway, Vidkun Quisling, the Nazi collaborator whose name would become synonymous with collaboration in multiple languages, was tried in August 1945 and executed by firing squad on October 24, 1945. His final statement expressed no remorse. He died proclaiming his nationalist ideology. These high-profile executions sent a clear message. Collaboration with the Nazis carried the ultimate penalty. But they also established a pattern that would persist for decades. The most prominent figures were tried quickly, while lower-level collaborators faced slower, more complicated processes. In Austria, the situation was unique. Austria was officially considered a victim of Nazi aggression under the Moscow Declaration of 1943, issued by the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. This designation meant that Austria was liberated rather than defeated, and Austrians were portrayed as victims of Nazi occupation rather than willing participants. This framing had significant consequences for accountability. While some Austrians were tried for war crimes, the overall prosecution effort in Austria was less intensive than in France or Belgium. Many Austrian Nazis simply reintegrated into Austrian society without facing prosecution. But not all of them escaped. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, one of Austria's most prominent Nazi collaborators finally faced execution. Ernst Kaltenbrunner had been a high-ranking Nazi official, head of the Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, and a key architect of the genocide. He had been captured, tried at Nuremberg, convicted, and sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging on October 16, 1946. But Kaltenbrunner was not the last Austrian collaborator to face execution. In the years that followed, dozens of other Austrian Nazis were tried, convicted, and in some cases executed. Some of these trials occurred years after the war ended, as Austrian authorities slowly pursued cases that had been shelved in the immediate post-war period. One significant case involved Anton Mussert, the leader of the Dutch Nazi Party, NSB. Mussert was tried in November 1945 and executed by firing squad on May 7, 1946. He went to his death in a state of apparent shock, unable to comprehend that he was actually being executed. In Greece, collaboration had taken on a particularly violent character. Greek security battalions, formed under German occupation and staffed by Greek collaborators, had committed atrocities against Greek resistance fighters and civilians. After the war, surviving members of these battalions faced trials. Some were executed. Others received prison sentences. The trials continued into the 1950s. But the pattern was becoming clear. The immediate post-war period saw rapid prosecutions and executions. As time passed, the pace slowed. Some collaborators remained at large, hiding in plain sight or having fled to other countries. The question was whether justice would continue to pursue them decades after the war's end. By the early 1950s, the intensity of collaborator hunts had diminished significantly. In Western Europe and Austria, Cold War considerations took precedence. Germany was divided, and both East and West Germany wanted to move forward. The Soviet Union pursued its own vendettas against Nazi collaborators, but showed little interest in broader justice. Many accused collaborators were released from prison. Some received suspended sentences. Others disappeared into obscurity. But the hunt never completely stopped. Survivor organizations, particularly Jewish groups, maintained lists of suspected Nazi collaborators. They pursued leads. They tracked movements across borders. And periodically, they would provide information to law enforcement that would result in an arrest. In the 1960s, a second wave of prosecutions began, not as intense as the first wave, but significant nonetheless. As society stabilized and historical perspective improved, governments began reinvestigating cases that had been shelved. In Austria, one particularly significant case emerged in the 1960s. Franz Mührer had been a Nazi administrator in the Vilna ghetto during the Holocaust. After the war, he returned to Austria and lived openly, working as a laborer and later as a shopkeeper. For years, no one knew his identity or his past. But in 1960, a survivor recognized him. Mührer was arrested and tried. The trial became a major event in Austria, raising difficult questions about collaboration and guilt. Mührer was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1963. He died in prison in 1986. Around the same time, Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was being hunted across South America by Nazi hunters and survivors organizations. Barbie had been a Gestapo officer, not technically a collaborator in the formal sense, but he had worked closely with French collaborators. He evaded capture until 1983, when he was finally tracked down in Bolivia and extradited to France. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1987. In Germany itself, a major investigation effort was launched in the 1960s. The Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes, established in 1958, began systematically reviewing cases. In 1963, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials began, prosecuting 22 former Auschwitz personnel. While most were not collaborators in the formal sense but rather perpetrators directly, the trials demonstrated that post-war Germany was willing to pursue accountability years after the war's end. In France, Paul Touvier, a French Gestapo officer and collaborator, was tried and executed in 1947. But other French collaborators evaded capture for decades. Maurice Papon, a Vichy official who had organized the deportation of Jews from Bordeaux, lived freely for decades before being identified in the 1980s. He was not tried until 1997, when he was convicted and imprisoned. He lived until 2007, dying at age 96 as a convicted war criminal. The case of Papon became emblematic of a broader problem. How long could accountability be delayed before it lost all meaning? Papon was tried 52 years after the war ended. He was 87 years old at the time of his trial. By the time of his conviction, he had lived a full life, built a career, raised a family, all while his past crimes remained unpunished. In Norway, the hunt for Nazi collaborators continued well into the 1960s. Some of those who had fled the country were tracked down, extradited, and tried. The most significant case involved Vidkun Quisling, who, as noted, had been executed in 1945. But dozens of other Norwegian collaborators faced trial years after the war. One particularly interesting case from the 1960s involved Henry Rinnan, a Norwegian resistance member who had also collaborated with the Nazis. His case revealed the moral complexities of collaboration. Some people had worked with multiple sides, making their ultimate allegiance unclear. Rinnan was executed in 1947 for his collaboration, despite his also having worked with the resistance. In Eastern Europe, the situation was even more complicated. Soviet authorities pursued their own trials of suspected collaborators, though these were often show trials serving propaganda purposes rather than serious justice efforts. In Poland, some collaborators were tried and executed in the immediate post-war period. But many escaped, either to Western Europe or to other countries. The case of Amon Goth, the commandant of the Plaszow concentration camp, is instructive. Goth was captured by American forces, tried at Nuremberg, convicted, and executed by hanging on September 13, 1946. But Goth was a direct perpetrator rather than a collaborator. His case was handled through the main Nuremberg trial, not through the secondary trials that addressed collaborators. As the 1960s progressed into the 1970s, it became clear that some Nazi collaborators would never face justice. They had escaped, changed identities, died, or simply been lost to historical memory. But others would be found. And for some, the execution would come decades after the war, decades after they thought they had escaped accountability. As the decades passed, executions became increasingly rare. Most post-war justice systems abolished capital punishment. In France, execution was abolished in 1981. In Austria, capital punishment for ordinary crimes had been abolished before the war. Most Western European countries eliminated the death penalty over the course of the 1970s and 1980s. This meant that collaborators tried in the 1970s and beyond faced imprisonment rather than execution. But in some countries, executions continued longer. In Eastern Europe, capital punishment persisted longer. In Yugoslavia, some Nazi collaborators and suspected war criminals faced execution into the 1970s. In the Soviet Union, execution remained standard punishment for major war crimes throughout the Cold War period. One significant case from the 1970s involved Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo official known as Gestapo Müller. Despite being one of the most wanted Nazi fugitives, Müller was never captured. His fate remains unknown. He likely died in the chaos of the war's end, but this was never confirmed. His case became one of history's great unsolved mysteries, a high-ranking Nazi who simply disappeared. But other cases were resolved, albeit slowly and painfully. In Austria in 1975, a man named Karl Linus was identified as a war criminal. Linus had been the commandant of the Kluga concentration camp in Estonia during the Holocaust. After the war, he had fled to the United States and built a successful life. He even became an American citizen. But in 1978, the U.S. Justice Department began investigating his background. It took years of legal proceedings, but Linus was eventually deported from the United States. Linus was returned to the Soviet Union, where he was tried and executed in 1987, 42 years after the war's end. His case demonstrated that even those who had successfully fled to distant countries could eventually be caught and held accountable. In France, another significant case emerged in the 1990s. René Bousquet had been a Vichy police official who had organized roundups of Jews for deportation. After the war, he had lived openly in Paris, had become a successful businessman and journalist, and had maintained ties to French political circles. For decades, his role in the Holocaust was overlooked or deliberately forgotten. But in the 1990s, investigative journalists and historians began examining Vichy's role in the Holocaust more systematically. Bousquet's past was exposed. He was charged with crimes against humanity in 1991. His trial was set for 1993. But before the trial could begin, Bousquet was assassinated in his Paris apartment on June 8, 1993, by a disgruntled tenant with grievances unrelated to the war crimes. Bousquet died without facing trial or conviction, escaping legal accountability through murder rather than through any legal mechanism. His case raised troubling questions about justice delayed. Bousquet had lived freely for nearly 50 years after the war, while his victims suffered. Even when he was finally brought to justice, he escaped through assassination rather than facing conviction. In Germany, investigations into Nazi collaborators and perpetrators continued into the 2000s. While capital punishment had been abolished in West Germany, some Nazi criminals faced long prison sentences. Klaus Barbie, as noted, was tried and imprisoned in 1987. He died in prison in 1991. In Eastern Europe, the situation was complicated by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of new nations from the Soviet republics. Ukraine, for example, had to confront its own complex history of collaboration during the Nazi period. Some Ukrainian nationalists had collaborated with the Nazis in hopes of achieving independence. After the Soviet Union collapsed, these historical figures became controversial political symbols. The case of Andriy Melnik, a Ukrainian nationalist leader, illustrates this complexity. Melnik had collaborated with the Nazis during the war, but he had also worked to maintain Ukrainian independence. After the war, he lived in exile in North America. He was never tried for his wartime actions. When he died in 1964, he was given a funeral attended by thousands of Ukrainian exiles who viewed him as a nationalist hero rather than as a war criminal. This case demonstrates one of the enduring challenges of post-war justice: the distinction between historical actors who had committed crimes and historical actors who were seen as heroes by parts of their own communities. But the most dramatic evidence that justice could move slowly came in the 1990s and 2000s, when investigations into World War II crimes continued to yield results. In 1998, one of the last known executions of a Nazi collaborator occurred. Anton Meloth was an Austrian Nazi who had served as a guard in the Theresienstadt ghetto, where he had beaten and killed prisoners. After the war, he had fled to the United States and lived in Colorado under an assumed name. For decades, he was unknown. But in the 1990s, investigators identified him. He was deported from the United States to Germany and tried. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1991. He died in prison in 2002, having lived until age 94, without ever facing capital punishment, but spending the last decade of his life in prison. However, in some Eastern European countries, executions of war criminals did continue later than in the West. In 1998, Andriy Rebrik, a Ukrainian who had collaborated with the Nazis and was accused of participating in atrocities during the Holocaust, was executed in Ukraine. At that point, Rebrik was one of the last known executions of a Nazi collaborator in Europe. He died more than 50 years after the war's end, having evaded capture for nearly half a century. The execution of Rebrik in 1998 marked, for many historians, the end of an era. The direct perpetrators and collaborators of the Holocaust were dying of old age. The few remaining ones who had not been caught and prosecuted would likely remain free. Capital punishment was being abolished across Europe. The age of executing Nazi war criminals had come to an end. But the question of what justice actually meant, whether it had been served, whether it had come too late, whether the guilty had escaped, remained unresolved. The most troubling aspect of post-war collaboration justice is how many perpetrators escaped entirely. Despite decades of hunting, despite survivor testimonies, despite documentary evidence, many Nazi collaborators lived their entire lives after the war without facing justice. The exact number is impossible to determine. Thousands of collaborators certainly escaped prosecution. Some fled immediately after the war and lived in hiding. Others built new lives under assumed identities. Still others were never identified or suspected because they had occupied minor positions that left little documentary evidence. Their stories reveal the fragility of post-war justice systems that depended on finding and identifying perpetrators decades after their crimes. One of the most striking examples is the case of Adolf Eichmann, who, while not technically a collaborator, but rather a Nazi perpetrator, had worked closely with collaborators across occupied Europe. Eichmann escaped to Argentina after the war and lived there for 15 years before being captured by Israeli agents in 1960. His trial in Jerusalem became one of the most significant war crimes trials of the post-war period. But for every Eichmann who was eventually caught, there were many more who were never found. In France, numerous lower-level Vichy officials who had participated in deportations simply disappeared into the general population. Some relocated to other countries. Others stayed in France but were never identified. Their names and faces faded from memory. In Belgium, some members of the Rexist movement and other collaborationist organizations fled to Spain, Argentina, and other countries where they lived openly, protected by sympathetic governments, or simply by the difficulty of tracking fugitives across borders. In Austria, many Nazis simply reintegrated into Austrian society. Austria's official narrative as a victim of Nazi occupation meant that fewer Austrians faced prosecution compared to Germans, French, or Belgians. Many Austrian collaborators benefited from this lenient treatment and went unpunished. The case of Kurt Waldheim, the former UN Secretary General, illustrates how successfully some collaborators could hide their pasts. Waldheim had served as a Wehrmacht officer during the war, and there are credible allegations that he was aware of atrocities. But for decades, his wartime service was not widely known. It wasn't until 1986, when he was running for president of Austria, that his past came to light. He was elected president despite, or perhaps because of, the revelations about his wartime service. In Eastern Europe, the situation was even more chaotic. The Soviet occupation of Eastern European countries meant that some Nazi collaborators faced justice administered by the Soviet Union, which had its own political motivations for trials. But many others escaped because records were lost, communities were destroyed, or Soviet authorities were more interested in pursuing their own political enemies than in systematic war crimes prosecution. The case of Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who had saved Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust, illustrates how confused the post-war period was. Wallenberg was captured by Soviet forces in 1945 and died in a Soviet prison, likely killed by the Soviets. His death went unexplained for decades. But numerous Hungarian collaborators who had persecuted Jews simply disappeared into the post-war chaos, never identified, never tried. In Greece, some members of the security battalions that had collaborated with the Nazis fled to Italy and other countries. Some were captured and tried. Others were never found. One of the most significant cases of escape involved Alois Brunner, an Austrian Nazi who had supervised the deportation of Jews from multiple countries. After the war, he fled to Syria, where he lived until his death in 2001. Despite being wanted by multiple countries, he was never extradited or captured. He died as a free man, never facing trial for his crimes. The case of Brunner demonstrates a crucial reality. Some of the most significant Nazi collaborators and perpetrators simply escaped justice entirely. They evaded capture, lived long lives, died of old age, and never faced legal accountability. For every collaborator who was executed or imprisoned in the years after the war, there were likely several more who escaped completely. This reality has profound implications for how we understand post-war justice. The trials, executions, and imprisonments that did occur were significant and served important purposes. They established legal precedent. They acknowledged the victims. They demonstrated that accountability was possible. But they also represent a relatively small fraction of those who participated in Nazi crimes and collaboration. The vast majority of perpetrators escaped legal consequences. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about the legacy of Nazi collaboration trials. Justice was not proportional to the scale of the crimes. It was selective, delayed, and often dependent on luck. Whether a perpetrator happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, whether a survivor happened to recognize them, whether documentation happened to survive. The last executions of Nazi collaborators occurred in the 1990s and early 2000s, nearly 50 years after the war's end. After that point, capital punishment had been abolished or was no longer pursued for Nazi-era crimes in most of Europe and North America. The trials continued, but the verdicts were prison sentences rather than death sentences. In 2005, more than 60 years after the war's end, a German court convicted a former Nazi guard of accessory to murder based on his presence at a concentration camp. He was 83 years old. His conviction was possible because German law had evolved to allow prosecution based on mere participation in the system of genocide, rather than on specific acts of violence. This legal evolution represented a shift in how justice could be pursued even decades after the war. If someone had been present in a concentration camp and part of the system that murdered thousands, they could be held accountable, even if no specific victim could be linked to their actions. By the 2010s and 2020s, German prosecutors and courts had become remarkably active in pursuing final cases against elderly Nazi perpetrators. In 2015, Oskar Gröning, the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, was convicted at age 93. He had not committed specific acts of violence, but had facilitated the operation of Auschwitz through his administrative role. His conviction demonstrated that the principle of accountability extended beyond direct perpetrators to those who enabled the system. In 2020, a 93-year-old former Stutthof concentration camp guard was convicted of complicity in over 5,000 murders. In 2022, a 101-year-old former guard at Sachsenhausen concentration camp was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, a symbolic sentence given his age and the fact that he would likely not live to serve it, but significant nonetheless, because it represented official legal recognition of his guilt. These late convictions raised important questions about the meaning of justice. What does it mean to convict someone at age 93 or 101 for crimes committed 75 or 80 years earlier? Is such justice meaningful, or is it performative? A legal gesture that satisfies the need to punish wrongdoing without providing any genuine consequences. Survivors and their descendants argued that it matters. It matters because official recognition of guilt is important. It matters because the principle that there is no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity needs to be affirmed. It matters because the perpetrators deserve to be named and their crimes documented, even if punishment cannot be enforced. But critics argued that prosecuting frail elderly people decades after their crimes, people who are unlikely to serve substantial prison sentences, is an inadequate response to genocide. True justice, they argued, would have required immediate and systematic prosecution of all perpetrators, not selective trials spread across 75 years. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The trials and executions of Nazi collaborators and perpetrators that occurred in the post-war period served multiple functions. They established legal precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity. They provided platforms for survivor testimony that ensured the historical record would document what happened. They demonstrated, at least symbolically, that accountability was possible. But they also left vast numbers of perpetrators unpunished. They were delayed, selective, and often dependent on luck and chance. Many of the most significant perpetrators escaped entirely, and the extended timeline of justice, from the 1945 executions through the trials of the 2010s and 2020s, meant that many victims died without seeing their perpetrators brought to justice. The case of Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, is emblematic. Wiesenthal spent his entire life tracking down Nazi perpetrators and collaborators. He helped identify dozens of significant war criminals. But he also recognized that his work would never be complete. There were simply too many perpetrators, and the window for justice was closing as survivors died and documents were lost. The enduring question is whether justice that comes 50, 60, or 70 years after a crime is truly justice at all, or is it merely a historical accounting, a way of ensuring that the record is clear and the guilty are named, even if actual punishment cannot be effectively administered. For the families of victims who waited decades to see their loved ones' killers brought to justice, only to find that the perpetrator was in his 80s or 90s, the answer was often bitter. Yes, the perpetrator was finally convicted, but they had lived decades of freedom. They had built families, careers, and comfortable lives after committing atrocities. On the other hand, from the perspective of those who pursued justice decades after the war, what mattered was establishing the principle. What mattered was ensuring that perpetrators could not escape accountability forever. What mattered was that the historical record would be clear about who did what, even if full justice could not be achieved. The last Nazi collaborators to be executed died between the 1940s and the 1990s. Some were executed quickly after the war. Others escaped for decades before being captured and tried. A few were executed as late as the 1990s. But by the 2000s, executions had ended. Modern Europe had abolished capital punishment. This meant that the era of Nazi perpetrators and collaborators facing execution had come to an end. But the era of pursuing and prosecuting them continued, and continues to this day. The legacy of these trials, the executions, the imprisonments, the convictions, is complicated. They represent an attempt to achieve justice in circumstances that made true justice impossible. They established important legal precedents. They honored the memories of victims by ensuring that their stories were heard and that their killers were named and held accountable. But they also represent the limitations of post-war justice. They show us that accountability is imperfect, delayed, and inadequate to the scale of the crimes. They demonstrate that most perpetrators escaped entirely, that many victims died without seeing justice, and that true reckoning requires more than legal trials. It requires cultural, political, and social change. The question we must ask is not whether the trials and executions of Nazi collaborators were sufficient. They clearly were not. But whether the ongoing commitment to accountability, even decades and centuries after crimes were committed, serves a valuable purpose. The answer seems to be yes. Because as long as perpetrators can be identified and held accountable, as long as the principle of no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity is affirmed, as long as the historical record documents who did what and why, then some form of justice is possible. It may not be complete, it may not be swift, it may not satisfy all victims and their families, but it is something. And something, in the face of such vast crimes, is perhaps all we can reasonably ask for. The last Nazi collaborators were executed in the 1990s, but the work of accountability continues, because as long as there are survivors to bear witness, as long as there are historians to document the truth, as long as there are communities committed to remembering, the hunt for justice, delayed as it may be, continues. That hunt is the dark chapter this story tells, but it is also, in a way, a chapter of hope. Hope that accountability is possible. Hope that the guilty can be found. Hope that the victims can be honored, even if true justice can never be fully served.